Hello and welcome to Westferry Times and the Deep Dive. This is where we try to get beneath the surface of the stories shaping our world. Today, we're looking squarely at the UK's fields and farmlands. There's a growing wave of protest happening. You might have seen the tractors in town centers, or maybe heard the voices getting louder, from farmers right across the country, Kent to Cumbria. Something's definitely going on. To help us really unpack this, the causes, the effects, and maybe where things are heading, we're joined by James Cartwright. James is an agricultural policy analyst. He's also owned a farm himself, and he's been following the situation very closely. James, a very warm welcome to Westferry Times and the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me. It's certainly a critical time to be discussing this.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you for tuning into Westferry Times. James, farming, it always faces challenges. There's the weather, unpredictable markets, and Brexit's lingering effects. But what's different now? What are these sort of intensified pressures pushing farmers towards these protests we're seeing?
You're right. Farmers are generally very resilient. But the last year or so has seen, well, a real pileup of pressures making things particularly tough. We've got these post-Brexit trade deals, for instance. They open the door to cheaper imports. And there's a genuine fear of being undercut, often by food produced to, let's say, different standards.
Okay.
And at the same time, the costs for farmers themselves, things like animal feed, fuel, and especially fertilizer, they've shot up really significantly.
Right.
On top of that, there have been delays, sometimes quite serious delays, in getting subsidy payments out from DEFRA. For many farms, that money is absolutely vital for cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this whole big shift, this transition away from the old subsidy systems towards these new environmental land management schemes.
That was part of the green Brexit promise we heard about, wasn't it? Rewarding environmental work.
Exactly, that's the stated aim. Reward farmers for sustainable practices for environmental goods. But the feeling on the ground among many farmers is that the old support is disappearing before the new system is, well, properly working or even financially viable for them.
So it feels like the rug's being pulled out from under them without a safety net.
That's a good way to put it. It feels like a major policy shift without a clear, secure way to navigate it.
So it sounds like a mix then. Economic pressures, big policy changes, maybe feeling a bit abandoned in the process?
Absolutely. I've heard the phrase death by a thousand cuts used quite a bit. Each issue just adds to the overall burden, making the whole situation feel pretty unsustainable for many.
Was there a specific trigger, though? Something that really acted as the final straw and got the tractors rolling?
Well, it was probably a few things coming together. The trade deals with Australia and New Zealand certainly caused a lot of alarm.
Worries about cheap meat and dairy.
Exactly. Concerns that imports produced potentially to lower environmental or animal welfare standards could flood the market and undercut British farmers.
Then there's the phasing out of the basic payment scheme. For years, that was a core part of farm income. Now it's going, and the replacement, well, it's not seen as clear, easy to access, or supportive enough yet.
Right.
And honestly, just the sheer amount of red tape, the bureaucracy involved in trying to get into these new environmental funding schemes, the delays have just added this layer of intense frustration. I mean, some farmers are talking about 50-plus pages of paperwork just to apply.
Wow. 50 pages.
Yeah.
You've been speaking directly with farmers, haven't you? What are you hearing from them personally? What's the impact on the ground?
The overwhelming feeling is one of being, well, left behind, not really valued. I spoke to Sarah, for instance. She's a third-generation sheep farmer up in North Yorkshire. Her family's worked that land for decades. She told me, quite starkly, that her income has plummeted down 40% in just the last 2 years.
40%.
Yeah.
That's huge for any business, let alone a family farm. It's massive. And she said something that really stuck with me. They say go green, but they don't give us the tools or the time. It just perfectly sums up that disconnect between the policy aims and the reality farmers are dealing with.
Yeah, that really hits home.
And Sarah's story, sadly, isn't an isolated case. I also talked with Ben. He's an arable farmer, grows crops near Hereford. He's actually been part of several protests. You made it really clear, blocking roads isn't what they want to do. He said, I'm quoting him here, "I don't want to block roads. I want to grow wheat, but we've got no other way to be heard."
That speaks volumes, doesn't it? That sense of desperation, feeling like there are no other options left.
It really does. You sense that frustration, that feeling of being pushed right to the limit.
And it's crucial we remember, isn't it, that these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or policy documents. These are real people, real families, their homes, their futures tied up in these farms.
Absolutely. And, for so many, farming isn't just how they earn a living. It's a way of life. deeply connected to family history, to the land itself. There's a huge amount of pride involved. So
Sure.
when that feels threatened, the reaction is bound to be strong, passionate. I remember previous reforms, the anxiety levels were high then, but this feels, well, it feels amplified with all the other pressures now.
Okay, so given these protests, this level of concern, how has the government actually responded? What's the official line from DEFRA?
Well, DEFRA has put out statements acknowledging the challenges. Definitely, they talk about their commitment to supporting farmers. They consistently point towards the environmental land management schemes, ELMS, as they're known as the way forward, rewarding farmers for environmental work.
But that's the scheme farmers are finding difficult.
That's the feedback, yes. The common view from farmers is that in their current form, these ELMS schemes are often underfunded, the application process is way too complicated, and the guidance, well, it can be pretty vague. It doesn't give them the clarity they need to plan for the long term. It's quite different, say, from some simpler, more results-focused schemes you see elsewhere, maybe in parts of the EU, where it's more about directly rewarding outcomes with less paperwork.
And we've seen politicians, MPs visiting farms. How are those visits being received? Are they helping?
There have been quite a few, yes. High-profile visits. I suppose the intention is to show support, offer some reassurance. But honestly, many farmers I've spoken to tend to see them as, well, PR exercises, photo opportunities that don't really lead to actual changes in policy or show a deep grasp of the
We're a
problems.
bit cynical about them, perhaps.
A bit. There's a feeling that the core issues, the fundamental problems, aren't really being tackled head-on.
Okay, looking at the politics more broadly then, is any particular party really championing the farmers' cause right now, offering solid support?
It's actually quite tricky politically for everyone involved. The conservatives, traditionally, have a strong base in rural areas, so this level of unhappiness is a significant challenge for them. They keep saying they support British farming, of course, but these trade deals and the bumpy rollout of the new subsidies have definitely damaged trust in some quarters.
And labor.
Labor has shown some support for the right to protest, and they acknowledge the sector's difficulties, but they haven't really laid out a detailed, fully worked out alternative plan for agriculture yet. What's really noticeable, though, is the National Farmers Union, the NFU. They're really stepping up the pressure,
Lobbying hard.
very hard. They're pushing all the parties to make clear, firm commitments to farming ahead of the next general election. They want concrete answers.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the public. How is all this landing with the general population? Are people sympathetic to the farmers?
It seems quite mixed, actually. You often see a wave of public sympathy when things directly affect consumers, empty shelves in the supermarket or the price of milk suddenly jumping.
Right, people connect with that.
They do.
Yeah.
People generally like the idea of supporting local food. They understand farmers are important. But on the other hand, there's also a perception among some parts of the public that maybe farmers are just resistant to change.
Particularly on environmental issues.
Yes, especially when it comes to climate change and adopting new, maybe greener farming methods. That narrative is definitely out there too.
And what role has the media played in shaping those perceptions?
Oh, a significant role, I think.
Yeah.
Headlines focusing purely on, say, tractor blockades can create an immediate negative image. They don't always give the full story, the
Right.
why behind the protest.
Lacking context.
Exactly. And sometimes portrayals can paint farmers as perhaps unwilling to adapt or maybe overly reliant on subsidies. That can create a divide, and it really oversimplifies a very complex situation. I mean, these trade deals, for example, often mean lower tariffs, making imports cheaper, but those imports might not meet the same high standards UK farmers have to stick to. It's not a level playing field.
It really does seem to highlight that potential gap between urban and rural understanding, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes. A huge gap. For many people living in cities, their connection to where food comes from really just starts and stops at the supermarket checkout.
So there's not always an awareness of the process.
Often not. Little awareness of the complex journey food takes, the economic pressures farmers are constantly juggling, or even the vital role they play just looking after the countryside, managing the land. That lack of understanding, that gap, it can easily lead to misunderstandings, maybe a lack of empathy for what the farming community is going through right now.
Okay, let's look ahead then. Farming, climate change, sustainability, they're all tightly linked. Is it actually possible for UK farmers to be both profitable, economically viable, and environmentally sustainable going forward?
It's not just possible, I'd say it's absolutely necessary for the future of farming itself and for the environment. But, and this is the crucial part, it needs a proper, well-supported transition. Farmers need the money, the investment to switch to more sustainable methods. They need the right training, the right advice, and crucially, they need time to make these changes work.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
Things like regenerative agriculture, which focuses on soil health, agroforestry, integrating trees into farming systems, practices that help capture carbon in the soil. These are real solutions, but they aren't cheap fixes, and they don't happen overnight. They often need upfront investment, and the financial returns might not be immediate. So that support during the transition phase is absolutely key.
Okay, hypothetical question then. If you were put in charge, if you were DeFry secretary for just one day, what would be your top 3 priorities to help farmers right now?
Right, defer I secretary for a day. Okay, 3 things immediately. First, I'd stabilize the short-term income support, get money flowing quickly to ease the immediate financial pain, and provide some basic security.
Okay, immediate relief.
Second, I'd launch a major simplification drive for those environmental schemes.
Yeah.
Make the applications much easier, less bureaucratic, and make sure they're properly funded and genuinely accessible for all farmers, big or small.
Cut the red tape.
Exactly. And third, crucially, I'd insist on much stronger protection for our local producers in any future trade deals. We need to ensure British farmers aren't put at an unfair disadvantage by imports produced to lower standards. The overall aim has to be helping farming transition sustainably, not letting it collapse under the pressure.
A sustainable transition, not a collapse. That sounds like a vital distinction. James, as we wrap up this deep dive, if there's one key thing you'd want everyone listening to take away about UK farmers today, what would it be?
I think I'd want people to really grasp that farmers do so much more than just produce our food. They are responsible for looking after something like 70% of Britain's land. They generally care deeply about the environment, about their animals, and they're often the heart of rural communities. What they desperately need right now isn't just slogans or sympathy, it's real, practical support and smart policies that recognize just how vital their role is for our food, our economy, and our landscape.
That's a really powerful point to end on. Thank you so much, James, for sharing your expertise and walking us through this complex issue today on the deep dive. It's been incredibly valuable.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
And a big thank you to all of you for joining us here on Westferry Times and the Deep Dive. If you found this discussion helpful, please do think about subscribing and maybe sharing it with others who might be interested. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed. Upbeat outro music fades in.